So where does that line, where do you draw that line though? Because right now somebody could just say, yeah, so, man wants to play in women's sports. You and I, maybe we would say, no, you shouldn't do that.
Right.
And that person would say, well, now you're trying to coerce me into something that I don't align with. And they're not hurting anybody. They're just beating them in races and, jumping higher than them. So what do you say to that? So I'm here with Eric Kaufmann, and I think this is going to be a fun podcast. I think it'll be interesting. There's a lot to talk about as it relates to institutional decline, conservatism, the future of Western civilization. And but first, before we get into any of those topics, I actually want to start with asking you just about your story, sort of what has happened to you over the past couple of years. And as I was doing a little bit of research into who you are and sort of your history, I read somewhere that you were at the University of London for 20 years and you're not there anymore. You're somewhere else. Can you tell a little bit about that story? What happened there?
Yeah, well, what happened was essentially I caught the rising curve of the Great Awakening, really. I've been an academic 25 years, so 4 years at one British university and then another 20 at Birbeck College, University of London. I knew people pretty well in my department, been there a long time. What started to happen, I guess I was, starting to be a little more open on Twitter, for example, and in the press about my views of the social justice movement and criticizing, the excesses of what I thought were the excesses of these movements and some of its avatars, like Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of where I'm from. So yeah, that was kind of the subtext, and then that annoyed some radical students and staff who, it was a combination of the Twitter mobbings. And then they would try and get me internally investigated by putting in a complaint, which of course seems to just automatically lead to, show up for a hearing at this period. So they're really chilling speech and they're trying to scare you. Even though they don't actually have anything legally on you, you don't know. They keep you guessing, right? And in the end, you're found guilty of something, some violation of, the policy in work and study, which is, again, one of these policies which is vague, has no real connection to the law. It's almost plucked out of the air. It's like you've misbehaved and offended somebody is basically the gist of it. And so, yeah, this had been happening for a few years. And then the university hit some hard times economically and they had a redundancy program. And I just thought, at the same time, I knew the University of Buckingham, which is the only free speech university in the country, I knew that I could probably get in there, even if not on a permanent basis. And I just thought, it's time to go. And it's not like it was totally intolerable. I kind of worked up to a position where, my main problem in my department, who was this radical young woman, had left, claiming I drove her out of academia, which is ridiculous. But anyway, she never said where she was going because she wanted to make it seem like she'd been driven out of academia. Of course, she then got a job next door. And anyway, so that was really interesting. But, it was starting to ebb with the Great Awakening kind of peaks 2020, 2021. The Twitter mobs started to fade or they would get ratioed online. And then I was using the Free Speech Union would issue me a legal letter. And it was under control in the sense I wasn't really worried anymore about my job. But on the other hand, it was just everyone knew about all these things that had been in the press. And so it just introduced a kind of awkwardness to interactions of all kinds and radioactivity to me. You don't need that if you don't have to have it, then why put up with it? Right? So.
Right. Well, okay. So I'm wondering what you sort of were feeling at the time, because you had been in academia for 20 years. Did you ever think that this was going to happen? Like that the institution that you were a part of for that long, that you had kind of given a lot of, your life to, would just sort of turn on you like that? Like, what were you feeling at the time?
Yeah. The first time these things happened, just a lot of anxiety. and the thing in the back of your mind is always like, oh, what are they going to do to me? Are they going to like fire me? Right? That's obviously because academia, you got 150 applications for every job. To get a job where you want to live, I mean, it's almost impossible. And of course, once you've been tarred with this brush, it'd be definitely impossible. So they have a lot, they have you over a barrel, and they know it. And so when they issue a threat, and now you can kind of bring people in who can help you, but it's a real whole surreal world. All these hearings, and of course, the way it works is the lowest level, which would be like the school or faculty level. The people who volunteer to be on these kangaroo courts are typically true believers, and they will come up with the craziest stuff you'd ever like. They accused me of writing. I wrote a review of one of Douglas Murray's books in a newspaper, a prominent newspaper, and I used this term "slaying the dragon," which Douglas Murray used in that book a bunch of times. And when I talk about slaying this dragon of this woke ideology, they accused me of meaning that literally like I wanted to slay a colleague. And they actually were serious about that. And they said this is kind of like a threat. Yeah. This was like a published review in a paper. That's the level of ridiculousness they were going to.
How did you not like? I'd flip out. I'd be like, "You people." I mean, maybe you did. I don't know, but I would have like probably like that's insane. Like, how is that even possible? And are these people like college educated people? Are these actual? No, these are just
they're academic. They're professors and
these are real.
Now they may not be. They may not be. I think they are not the most accomplished. They're probably more on the scholar activist side, but but even the administrator, he just wants this to go away. And I'm the easiest, person to press, rather than trying to resist the inquisitors, or the people who complained, I'm the one he can put under pressure, right? There's no real blowback to him by doing that. Now, the top of the university where they have, legal advice, they have to deal with the real world. There, if you appeal it up there, then you get some sanity at least, and people they know, well, we either are going to have to do something legal, in which case that's going to be something we're going to lose, or we're going to. So what they'll do is they'll just give you a sort of warning, or you've got I'm trying to remember what they called it. Not like you're kind of in the red, but some kind of zone you're in. This knife is hanging over your head.
You
right?
got a yellow card or something like that. You're
like you've been given a warning. Like, okay, so does that mean like the next? They don't say what the next time. Does that mean the next time around I'm gone? They kind of want that dangling so that you behave, right? But I think this is really it's funny. It doesn't actually come from the higher up you go, the more they're all about just making it go away and trying to sort of satisfy the people who complain, so the people who complain don't make trouble. And they're running scared, like the leadership's running scared of these radical academics and students all the time. A lot of the motive for this is coming out of these radicals who pressure the university, and they also pressure them over years. So they've got these policies in place which in some ways give them a playing field advantage. Like the playing field's already stacked against you because you've got these policies that say you must respect, and not harass, and all these other terms which are vague. So they can say, oh, he harassed, he didn't respect, and therefore he violated this policy and that policy. And it's not a legal thing. So there's no proper legal interpretations. It's just kangaroo stuff.
Well, I think this leads into sort of a topic that I wanted to talk about with you is institutional decline, because some of that stuff is, to me, it's absolutely crazy that they've been they're not only doing this stuff just sort of flippantly, like if you say something that they disagree with, they're just going to like get rid of you. But it seems like they've got all of the red tape ready to go. They've got all of these policies, these random things that they've been doing for decades, for years and years, when people like you're not focusing on all of the new policies being put in place over decades. Nobody's doing that because we have other things to do with our life. And yet then that's what they're going to use against you. And this sort of is the big question right now that I think a lot of people are asking about our institutions in the West, not just the universities, but I think this is happening all across the board, whether that be government agencies or churches. There's a lot of churches, church institutions, denominations, whatever it is. There seems to have been something happening over several decades where they've got a lot of stuff set up, ready to get rid of the people they want to get rid of and just totally take control of the institutions. And I'm not exactly sure what you even do about that as we move forward as a civilization and trying to either reform these institutions, or do we just say, all right, let them just self-destruct? Or what do you say to that?
Well, what I would say is I don't think they're going to self-destruct. And I think it's a mistake to think, oh, well, we'll set up our own institutions and the good will drive out the bad. People will vote with their feet, this kind of free market approach. That's fine for something like podcasts, which you can set up reasonably easily. But for universities and, government agencies, yes, you can, of course, as we're seeing with the Department of Education in the US, you can get rid of certain government agencies, but it's very difficult. And my view is a bit like I compare Elon Musk taking over Twitter to setting up Gab, Parler, and Truth Social, right? Let's just take these two models where the impact of Gab and Parler, fine, some people can have a free space, but it's tiny and you're not having any influence. I'm not saying no to those startup things, but I'm just saying taking over Twitter is just so much more monumental in terms of changing things. And similarly, what I'd say for the public school system, government agencies, is so much more effective to take them over and change them than to think you can somehow either make new ones and somehow, even the idea of breaking them up and devolving it to the states, I think is not necessarily the win people think it is, because it's then going down to another level, which probably often is more easily controlled by the left. And so I would say better to try and get control, because you can get elected every other time, whatever. Elected government is probably the only institution the majority can control, and it needs to use that institution of elected government to reform all of these agencies and the school systems. And that's what I mean is I would rather reform rather than simply hope to abolish and start your own. Sometimes start your own makes sense, like with small new media, but universities are not a free market. I think schooling is, I think with school choice, great idea, but I think the problem is if the teacher training, accreditation, all these other things are all pumping out the same curriculum and the same attitudes, then it doesn't matter if you've got more people in private education or charter schools. The same ideology is going to be occurring. And so it's like with universities that's school choice. You can choose whichever college you want to go to. Has that helped fix the problem of woke capture now?
Well, this is interesting. I don't actually know what I think about this yet, but as I'm thinking through what you're saying and even just thinking about the universities specifically, it is sad. Like in my lifetime, I'm only 25. Places like Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge, these were the most prestigious universities in the world. People wanted to go there. And that was sort of like a badge of honor. Nowadays, I feel like it's not really a badge. Somebody says, I went to Yale, you're sort of suspicious of them. Like, okay, like, does that mean you're like crazy or are you actually a genius? So that it's hard to figure that out now. So I don't know what the government involvement, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. I don't know how you specifically reform the universities from the sort of governmental angle. I understand that people vote representatives into office, and those people are supposed to represent the constituents. And if they have specific reforms they want to make, then they could do that. That said, as it relates to the interest of the teacher, like what I found to be terrifying in Madison, Wisconsin, which is incredibly progressive, was, and I didn't go to the university, but my wife went to the UW, and I grew up in the public school system here, that the teachers seem to be very, very, very focused on liberal ideology or progressive ideology, but actually like making people who would vote for Democrats. And I don't know, because the Democrats are right now the party of sort of the public schools and sort of big government. Mm-hmm. And how can you detach that? Because these people's livelihoods are attached to a big government. The larger the government, the more money they're going to make, the more, benefits they're going to have. How do you actually detach that if the government's directly attached to the public school system? If that makes sense.
Well, I guess my view is that, that plays a role, but I still don't think that's the main reason for their ideology. You could have people in the wealthiest public schools, Dalton in New York, and some of these other places are some of the worst in terms of ideology. And similarly, the top private universities. Now, I know they get a lot of federal funding, but still, I'm not sure that self-interest explains it. I think that I've come to the view that really the leading edge of the culture is often the people who think they're the most modern and on the leading edge of the culture tend to be overrepresented in the arts, in museums, in universities, in journalism. And so there is where you're going to, and teaching to a somewhat lesser degree, but there's where you're going to see these big ideological skews. That's something that's been building in the culture for, I would say, 50, 60 years. And so they're gradually taking over the personnel, the teacher training, and this becomes a machine. How do you break that up? Now, on the one hand, I think you have to use government, actually, to, what we're seeing with Doge, what we saw with DeSantis and some of the red states is, okay, you're not teaching critical race theory, gender ideology. We're not going to do DEI in government. We are not going to have ESG in pension, state pension fund, all of those kinds of legislation, not just the executive orders, but actually getting laws passed. So it makes it more permanent. I think one of the risks with all these executive orders, let's say that Doge and the Trump administration is putting out, is they're going to expire at some point. And, or be struck down in the courts. So you need to get these things passed as laws with guidelines issued that make it very clear exactly how narrowly you have to interpret that law. And that way I think you can squeeze out, or at least you can make people think twice before they indoctrinate. And because if they're caught, then there could be big repercussions. What you're trying to do is chill. You want people to be able to have debates, but you also have to chill indoctrination, and to have a chill, you need incentives. So there is this big debate. Some people think, oh well, we'll just persuade and exhort and get people to be brave. And I think all of that stuff is great, but I just don't think it's realistic. I think you need to have some carrots and sticks.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about then things like Peterson Academy? Obviously, you're a part of Peterson Academy, and I've watched your lectures, and I love Peterson Academy, one, because it's not going to destroy my bank account, and that's really great. But Peterson Academy is an interesting thing because, one, it's all online, which I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on in-person education compared to online education. But two, it's a lot cheaper, and seems right now it's completely detached from the system, the educational system. So, what are your thoughts on was that a new institution? I don't know what we would call Peterson Academy. Maybe an attempt at a new institution?
Yeah, it's a new institution, and you have the bricks and mortar ones, University of Austin, Ralston College, in Britain, University of Buckingham is kind of that. You have a number of these new institutions that have emerged, not that many, but a number of them. So Peterson Academy, has the potential, if it can get accreditation and give you that degree for getting a certain number of credits that's recognized, then that'll definitely be a route to bypassing the conventional system. And in fact, could be quite revolutionary. Now, I think there's a whole bunch of issues to think about. I mean, you talk about in-person versus online. The one thing I'd say is that at a lot of universities now, they're already cost-cutting to the point where a lot of students don't go to lectures very often. They just watch the recording. So I think the degree to which you're missing out on a lot might not be as great now as it might have been before the pandemic. So the differences between that in-person, so-called in-person and online experience is smaller now. So that's one thing I would say. Now, of course, there are benefits to bricks and mortar. in terms of social, you have a social circle of people you learn with if they're motivated, which most universities, they're very not, undergraduates are not very, most won't say anything in class. So you're missing a certain amount. You can get a little bit of that in the chat groups on Peterson Academy, though. And where maybe students are more motivated. What else do you miss out? Yeah, it's basically the social world. Maybe the sports if you're in the States.
Right. I don't even know if we should have sport. I mean, I get the NCAA is a massive money making thing, but I've noticed that sports it feels to me really degraded some universities. I even think about like certain universities, UW seem to be UW, Wisconsin here, primarily focused on sports and not really academics anymore. They're just sort of allowing as many people into their school as they possibly can. They just continue to expand and expand and expand, and it's very bizarre. Well, it's not bizarre. I mean, I think that they get more money the more people they have, so they're just like, oh, we need more people.
That's what it's about.
So then it just destroys the sort of prestige around, or the difficulty or the educational rigor that somebody goes through at these universities. And I think that sort of begs the question related to, do you think everybody should be going to the universities to get an undergrad degree? It feels like that's just a thing that you do when you're done with high school. And the people that I know who have done that spent 4 years getting drunk and, picking up a lot of really bad habits and not really, to be honest with you, learning anything that mattered in a lot of these schools, just so they could go make $80,000 at an accounting firm. And that seems weird to me because my grandpa worked at an insurance company for, 40 years and never got a degree, but he worked his way up. The job that he retired at would have been a job that you had to have a degree and a lot of qualifications for now, but he did just fine at that. So I know this is a little bit off topic, but why do you think that people actually should, like, part of reforming the universities, do you think could potentially be telling people that you don't need to go as much now? Like not as many people need to go to after high school?
Well, I think there's a couple of things you said there. I mean, one is that people don't necessarily acquire a lot of knowledge, and certainly knowledge that they're going to use in a job. And I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, there's obviously exceptions, if you're going to be a scientist or a medic or something. But for a lot of people, they're not going to remember much of what they learned. And it's mainly a sorting credential where the employer can say, oh, okay, they went there, and that's a reasonably hard place to get into, and so they must be there in the pile. And so, that's a good bona fide that I can use. So if we could come up with a different credentialing system, maybe just a standardized test that anyone can take, then that might be actually a more inexpensive way to do it. Now, there is also the fact that people who go to university tend to be from better off, on average, from better off families. And this is a place where you kind of, meet lifelong friends, possibly a spouse, groups, contacts that you may or may not be useful in your later life. It's a fun place, it's a finishing school, all these sorts of things. The question is, can society afford this kind of a holiday camp through subsidizing student loans? And, it's not clear. And especially when you get into bigger questions around that people are pausing, they're spending 3-4 years of their life. Now, what effects could that going to have on employment rates, especially with an aging population, birth rates, all these kind of things? Maybe we come to a point where governments say, no, we're just going to have to wind these down. I think the first stage is actually, and we're already seeing some consolidation, is the lower ranked universities these are the places where they're contracting. Some are going to the wall. Courses, people will take courses and they won't earn back the student loan, right? So the people who are getting degrees at lower ranked places and not earning enough money to pay for their student loan, that kind of person, that kind of course, I think is going to wither away gradually over time. And then, so I think it'll be a shaking out, but I think the top universities, the top R1, for example, in the US are going to remain. And actually, This is where I think the libertarian, we'll just privatize and slash and burn, and that'll solve the problem. I think that's wrong, because the cutting and the privatizing will all hit the bottom feeders. They'll go out of business, fine. They don't really influence the culture. It's the top 100 or even the top 20. That's where all these cultural trends are coming from. So you need to find a way to get at the top. It's not enough to just cut off even the bottom 2/3. It's going to have no real impact on the culture, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I understand what you're saying. There was one thing, especially related to institutional decline, and I guess the universities as well as the media companies, news companies, that I've just sort of been fascinated with, and I'd be interested to hear what you have to say. That when Trump won this last time around here in the United States, I thought that people would be like, okay, this is a decisive victory. Trump won. Obviously, everybody's pissed off at everything, and they want to get rid of all all this government spending, and they're angry at the universities and at, you have young kids who are being taught. I mean, 18 to 22-year-olds who are pro-Hamas, who just, there's sort of no moral compass for anywhere. And I thought, okay, things are going to change. These universities are going to be like, okay, yeah, we were doing something wrong. Or the news, CNN, which it was wishful thinking, but would be like, yeah, maybe we were wrong about Trump. And they aren't. They're doubling down even further. And I know you don't work for CNN or any of these places, but why are people doing that? Why are they continuing to double down even after it seems like the majority of the country, and then after the congressional address, 75% of viewers said that they approved of everything Trump said, and there was a decent amount of independent Democrat viewers. Trump is gaining more approval on certain things, and these institutions just are still not changing. Like, why is that?
No. Well, because they are echo chambers. Yeah. Now, I think there's different levels of echo chamberishness. Yeah. So the universities definitely are a bubble where it's very hard to get alternative views there. No doubt the teachers' unions would be like this too. But I think in the media, the mainstream media, I think it's not as closed. They do interact with journalists on the right to some degree. And I would say it's not as bad there. So actually, I mean, you say that they're doubling down, which I think is true in the case of the university. But if I were to compare, the aftermath of 2016 to the aftermath of 2024, the hysteria was much greater in 2016 than in 2024. So, yes, they're both doubling down to some degree, but I sense this time around, actually, some people are reflecting. And so, for example, this so-called vibe shift amongst some senior liberals, the New York Times, the Washington Post doing an editorial condemning mandatory diversity statements, the New York Times doing an editorial in favor of free speech, now the New Yorker publishing a piece saying critical of immoralization by an established journalist.
The New Yorker did that. Wow.
Yeah. It was, what is this? David Lenhart. I don't know how to pronounce it. And then you've got, there are some people, obviously the DEI is being rolled back in the corporations to a much greater extent. Obviously there's Musk, there's Facebook, Zuckerberg, there's Bezos. So there is, and also, there are some of the voices of people like Matthew Iglesias and Noah Smith, and some of these kind of center-left influencers are more openly criticizing trans and criticizing DEI. And so I think there's been a shift, and I think it's not as hysterical. Now, does that mean that, the vast majority of people are doubling down? And we've seen that in the U.S., the DNC, for example, you saw it on the vote on the trans bill, and so you've seen it. But at the same time, Gavin Newsom coming out.
Well, right, can I ask you a question about this? So I was just going to bring up Gavin Newsom as he's going to go out and talk to Charlie Kirk, and like my take on a lot of these people, even Mark Zuckerberg, like I have a hard time because I listened to Mark Zuckerberg on Joe Rogan and I thought, okay, like the most recent one, he sort of explained how the Biden administration was putting a lot of pressure on Facebook and there was just, you know, they were scared and I sort of get that. But do you think that that's actually genuine? And I don't know if we obviously can't know this for certain, like the Gavin Newsom coming out being like, yeah, you know, the trans stuff is too far. I'm kind of like, Gavin, what are you talking about, dude? Like your state, he's saying this while his state is actively continually participating in having men compete in women's sports. I don't know if they're actually genuine, or if they're seeing the shift and they're playing politics. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, they are playing politics, but just as Chris Rufo might say, just the fact they feel the need to disavow those policies means you're winning, right? So the fact that and this is not something that they can hide from their own followers, right? So the fact that they're willing to quite clearly go against what was a sort of sacred shibboleth on the left. The fact they're now willing to actually go against that tells me something I think that's quite important, which is this view that issue is killing the Democrats, that the sort of faculty lounge kind of university woke left, some of those positions, that those are politically toxic. And I think that's a very important vibe shift. And so I'm optimistic about that. And I think it's meaningful, even if they don't, who knows what Gavin Newsom actually believed. I mean, I think you could say maybe he doesn't believe in the trans thing, was faking it because that's where his political pressure was coming from. And now maybe he's shifted around. I can't read the guy's mind, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, and it makes me, I mean, as somebody who I like to think I'm a principled conservative, and I'd like everybody to be principled, even if they're principled in what they're wrong, even if they're wrong, but they believe in it. I look at somebody like an AOC or the Squad and I'm like, well, you know, they're totally wrong about everything, but at least they're like not changing, you know, that they don't shift and change. And so you're like, this person's actually just, you know, AOC, that they're actually just wrong, but they're willing to stand on that. Something like Gavin Newsom and even Joe Biden and some of these, you know, maybe old school liberal people who are playing with what the party wants them to say. I feel so weird about that because I'm like, I don't know who you are or what you believe in. If you're just going to go along with what everybody says, that seems sort of dangerous as well. And I don't know if you feel that way. Yeah. Everyone knows that over the past decade, legacy mainstream media like CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and the New York Times have lost credibility across the country. So many people don't trust them anymore as news outlets. They don't trust that they're actually going to tell the truth and not push some crazy progressive liberal agenda. And so they're moving toward independent outlets or new media companies like the Free Press or the Daily Wire to get their information, and that's all great and good. But what a lot of people don't know, and it's becoming more popular, but still many people have no idea, that a lot of the Christian institutions, whether that be the universities or the media companies, are also losing trust among people and are also lying and are also pushing an agenda and are also pushing a progressive narrative. Think of Christianity Today or the Gospel Coalition, two of the biggest evangelical, so-called evangelical Protestant media companies in the country are taking money from liberals and pushing a progressive ideology on their platforms, pro-immigration, even sometimes wavering on the issue of abortion and homosexuality and transgenderism. They seem to have no moral compass and have no idea what the Christian doctrine is because a lot of the people that are working there aren't actually Christians. Surprising to some people to hear, but not really to people who have actually read the garbage that they're putting out and pushing down people's throats. The worst part about this is that a lot of pastors and a lot of people in the church get their political, theological, and cultural information and news from these sources. They take these sources as beacons of truth and kind of just listen to whatever they say. So if Christianity Today says that we should just let immigrants flood through the border and rape and kill people, they'll be okay with that because they have trusted these institutions for a long time, not thinking that the institutions were just going to one day totally sell their souls for money, but that's actually what's happened. And so why am I talking about this? Well, I started something new because I've seen this problem, and I've not just seen it at the macro level across the country, but I've seen it at the local level. So many churches, so many pastors have sold out to a progressive agenda, and they're listening to institutions like Christianity Today and the Gospel Coalition to get their news, to get their information, and yet that stuff isn't actually Christian. It's not actually doctrinally sound. It's not actually in line with the teachings of Jesus. And because they don't have a core conviction that is in line with Scripture, they don't know how to apply it to the issues happening around them in politics, government, and news. So what I started is this newsletter called Orthodoxy and Order. Orthodoxy and Order is a weekly newsletter where I break down the 5 to 7 news stories from the previous week. I tell you what the story is, and then I give commentary explaining how we should look at these issues from a Christian perspective, from an actual Christian perspective, not gaslighting, not lying, not telling everybody this is too complicated for you to ever understand. No. I just tell you this is actually easy to understand. Some of these issues are really easy to understand, and here's how to think through things biblically. Here's how to think through things logically and reasonably. I'm not saying that everybody's going to agree with everything that I say, but it is a weekly newsletter, Orthodoxy and Order, and the link to subscribe to it is in the description. My goal is to create alternatives for Christians who actually want real news, who actually want the truth, who actually want people to tell them that, no, abortion's wrong, slaughtering children is wrong, butchering kids is wrong. Letting people come through the border is absolutely not okay without any consequences, and that can cause unintended harm or potentially, depending on how you look at it, intended harm from the Democrats. But we need to have better news outlets, ones for Christians that are coming from a Christian perspective that aren't equivocating, that aren't lying to everybody, that aren't pushing an agenda down people's throats and telling everybody that you have to be okay with people murdering children and butchering people and opening the border up and funding endless wars and producing death and pain. Like we have to be okay with saying that's actually wrong and we need to do something else. And so Orthodoxy and Order is my attempt at that. I hope that people will subscribe. If you click the link in the description, it'll take you there. You can subscribe. It'll come to your inbox every single Friday. And I'm totally open for feedback and for people to tell me that I'm wrong on issues, because I think that's kind of what this is for. Like, I'm open to the debate. But my goal is to create an alternative here, and Orthodoxy and Order is what that is. Also, this podcast is what that is. I want people to see that there are level-headed, thinking Christians who know how to actually apply their faith to their life and to their politics and to the government and to the world. So Orthodoxy and Order, click the link in the description and go follow it. And it costs $0. So follow it, subscribe to it, share with your friends. Thank you.
But what I'd say is AOC, right? You say she hasn't changed, but
Sure.
she removed her pronouns.
Really?
Right? Out of her profile.
Out of her like a X or something?
Yeah.
Wow.
So even though there's not like an obvious, hey, I'm changing like Gavin Newsom, I think it's still a significant signal. It's a subtle signal, but it's a significant one. And I think that's what I mean is back in 2016, all the momentum was towards more pronouns, more of this stuff. And now it's the other way. And I think that's actually important. It's an important moment because sometimes in the culture, you get these elite shifts. I'll give you an example. In the U.S. case between 1890 and 1910, the progressive elite in America shifted from being pro-immigration to being anti-immigration. That's the progressive elite, right? And so this would have been the mainline church, Episcopal church, Methodist. And then suddenly in the 1910s and 20s, they shifted back into a pro-immigration position. But these shifts occur at a very elite level. And so you can sometimes get these changes, like prohibition of alcohol in 1890 was a prestigious position to hold. And by 1920, it was no longer a prestigious position to hold. And one of the questions is, why do these what changes in the elite culture? And could we imagine, so is the trans issue an issue where, maybe it was prestigious amongst elites and it's lost prestige, or DEI, or a number of these things. My hunch is that there's been a loss of prestige at the elite top of the society. Now, that's still not going to filter down very far, but it could be the beginning of it. Sometimes change comes from the top. It doesn't always. Sometimes it can be a populist movement from below, but sometimes the elite really can lose confidence in its former beliefs and just change.
Right.
So it's not beyond the possible that could be happening.
It is interesting because you wonder how Ketanji Brown is going to be able to figure out, who AOC is, and now that she doesn't have her pronouns in her account anymore. Well, no, that is fascinating, and I would be, I'm interested to see what happens with the left right now, because it feels like, especially after the congressional address, everybody was sort of like, okay, you guys, you won't clap for the kid who beat cancer. Like, what's going on here? And they feel like they're sort of in disarray, and nobody really knows where they're going as a party in the United States, at least. I want to, though, shift into talking about the conservatism going forward in the West, in the United States. So I might be picking up on something that's not true here, but I'm interested in what you think about this. What I'm seeing with the Trump administration and with his picking J.D. Vance, which I thought was a very interesting pick, and I didn't see it coming, to be honest, is that Trump is definitely not like a principled conservative. I don't think that he has like a very deeply convicted, sort of what a Judeo-Christian belief system or anything like that. But I take him more as a libertarian on social issues. He seems to be a lot less, he's okay with homosexuality, all of that. He's fine with abortion. He's fine with IVF, some of the things that hardcore conservatives are not okay with. And yet I feel like J.D. Vance and even somebody like Pete Hegseth are, in some sense, disciples of Patrick Deneen and the sort of post-liberal worldview and the post-liberal conservatism. And that's interesting because that seems like those guys are younger and they seem to be sort of the future of the party. Do you think the Conservative Party is going in that direction? The Republican Party is going in that direction in the United States? Or is that just, am I totally off on my thought process there?
Yeah, it's really interesting. You've got these different currents. I mean, you have Trump, who is not particularly ideological. You've got the post-liberal current. But you've also still in Congress obviously got a lot of people who are motivated by the old low tax agenda, tax cut, right? And that sort of, and even free trade. I mean, that's, those strands are still there in Congress. And you're seeing these tensions. So, but obviously the congressional agenda is involving a tax cut, for example, which is a very traditional Republican thing to be talking about, which would easily go back to Reagan and the Bush brothers, or the Bushes, sorry. But, the tariff stuff and this idea of, more of a sort of isolationist foreign policy. I mean, these are some new strands that are kind of, I would say, linked to Compact magazine and some of the more elements of national conservatism. I actually think those are actually relatively unpopular, or at least the tariffs and this sort of economic autarky argument.
That's like his only principled position.
Yeah, I think it's going to possibly unravel, actually.
Really? Wow.
Because of just the response of the markets and the voters to higher prices, to recession, to any of these effects, which are going to be, when the markets drop, and it's going to be pretty hard to sustain, I think, that protectionism at a very high level, which is sort of initially mooted by Trump. Now, that's the economics, and that's fine, because I actually think the deeper, more significant aspect of this is cultural. And that I expect to endure much longer, which is first of all, the question of immigration, the question of how much you want your culture to change, at what rate, the question of what's taught in schools, what is the narrative about the country? Is it a narrative of shame that doesn't put American history in the context of other civilizations, right? So if you say, well, America's built on stolen land, you listen to that and it's true. But then if you say, well, all countries are built on stolen land, So that's a banal statement. It's only a question of how aggressive or how bloody were they in stealing it compared to others who stole. Then you actually get a more nuanced conversation and you remove a lot of the emotion, right? And that's what I mean is that we aren't getting that in any Western country. Okay, colonialism, Britain did colonialism. Obviously, the Mughals and the Aztecs and everybody else did colonialism. The Comanche did it. You want to talk about colonialism? Let's talk about it. Who was worse, I mean, and that would help to, because, there are surveys that'll show amongst young Americans, 70% of them say, the native peoples lived in peace and harmony before the European settlers arrived. And that just shows you how little they've been taught about history prior to contact with Europeans.
How little, or that they were taught a false narrative about. I heard that stuff in high school, like, the white men came and just slaughtered these innocent, very kind, very nice people. These people never did anything wrong. They were amazing. And my grandparents, we read history together growing up. So I kind of was like, I don't think that that's true. I'm not saying that everything that the Europeans did was ethical and good and morally righteous or anything like that. But that certainly isn't true, that all of these natives were just the most amazing people that ever existed. And so do you think that it's a lack of teaching or a particular narrative, a revisionist teaching?
I think it is both. I think it is revisionist. I did a survey with the Manhattan Institute with Zach Goldberg of 18 to 20-year-olds, and we found 90% of 18 to 20-year-olds had heard at least one of 6 critical race theory concepts, like unconscious bias, white privilege, white supremacy, systemic racism. At least one of those things was taught to them in school, or an adult in the school told them about it. And in almost 70% of cases, they were not taught any alternative, any other respectable alternative to that. So you are definitely getting brainwashing in critical race type concepts and gender ideology. But in addition to that, it is also the selectivity. So if you don't learn about the Comanche's empire, the Comanche Empire was a major empire. In fact, this is one of the reasons people didn't go in there for a long time, because this was a major empire and it was built on genocide and much more brutal genocide of native peoples. Slavery on the West Coast amongst indigenous peoples, it was stamped out by the British in 1851. Again, none of this would ever be known because there's almost like this whitewashing and this romanticizing of the noble savage. Now, we could say the same about other groups. Clearly, what were the African empires that existed at the time of American slavery were engaging in very brutal slave wars with each other. And they were the ones who extracted the slaves. Now, it doesn't make slavery right, but it means that you have to understand the full context, that this slavery was part of the human experience. Everyone was doing it. It's just a question of who was doing it worse. And this is something that's missing. And so, but this is not, so what I would say is, for conservatism, the school system has to be the number one priority, because you've got a generation growing up who have a very warped sense of the past. And that then means that undercuts the legitimacy of your nation when you say this nation's built on white supremacy, right? So we need to get to a place where we can have that more contextual conversation about, these were constants. Settler colonialism and genocide were constants in human history. Now, if we could to rank these things, probably the Arab slave empire was probably the worst. Maybe the Portuguese in Brazil was a close second. We could have these discussions, right, that would say, but here's the good, here's the bad. All of groups have a mix, and we're not going to have goodies and baddies in this story. It's going to be a lot more nuanced than that.
Everyone, it's almost like there's a theme, and I'm a Christian, so I think that this is true, but that people are sinful, or just people are not inherently always doing everything right all the time. And I know that not everybody believes that, but there is this sort of idea, I think, on the left that you have the victimizer ideology, or sort of the Marxist ideology. And there are people who are just inherently all good and people who are inherently all bad. And that just seems way too simplistic. And I don't know if any young people really even buy into that idea themselves, because even when you're young, trying to figure out like who you are, all that sort of stuff, you're doing stupid things and you're being bad. And then you're also doing good things and you're being good. So it's like, even individually, it's hard to really listen to somebody lecture you on how there are some really good people and some really bad people, when in your own life, you're like, yeah, but I struggle with trying to be good and not do bad things, but I want to do bad things. It just doesn't pan out. But when you're never taught the other side, and I know a lot of people who are never taught the other side, all they know is, I guess I just have to go along with this narrative. And then I think that narrative ultimately creates, I mean, we have, suicide and depression and among men, especially young men. It creates death, and that's really bad, I think. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, what you're saying, it makes sense. I would want to know, and I don't know if you have an answer to this, but like, specifically, how do you reform this stuff? Like, if you were the king of America and you got to do whatever you wanted, what would you do?
Well, I think I like this kind of conversation because I think you have to have a principled moral alternative, emotional alternative to the moral emotional narrative being pushed by the woke left. So, I think so I have this contrast between what I call cultural socialism, which is sort of the woke idea, which means basically equal outcomes by race, by sex, emotional harm protection from speech that you might find offensive if you're very sensitive and someone says, mispronounces your last name, and you think the person's right. This is what I mean. So
microaggressions, I think that's what they called it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I would say that the alternative to that cultural socialism is what I would call human flourishing, or a cultural holism, which says, okay, equality is an important value. Emotion or harm protection is an important value. These are the two moral foundations Jonathan Haidt would call the equality and the care harm moral foundations. Those are absolutely part of the good society, but they are not all of the good society. We have to think about other values: freedom, beauty, truth, cohesion of the society, meaning in the society. These are all also important. And we have to have a balance across all those values. And that's what I mean by a holistic, multidimensional approach, what I would call the full human flourishing approach, as opposed to the much more narrow cultural socialist approach, which is just focused on two dimensions and as they apply to race, gender, and sexuality. That is the sum total of their worldview. I think is a very constricted, narrow, and ultimately is not conducive to maximal human flourishing. So I think some kind of narrative around, in order to realize our human potential, we've got to get away from this very sort of constricting, illiberal, a barrier to truth, a barrier to cohesion and to culture. And we need to have more of a rich culture, and in a way, just like we had in the Cold War, where everyone understood that if you went for redistribution to the point of communism, where, no matter how hard you work, you get the same, we have total equality. People understood that represented, you couldn't do that without killing freedom, killing wealth, killing flourishing. And we understand that in economics. We have to have some welfare state, because people are going to slip through the cracks and some people can't make it. But if you have too much, then that strangles the economy. I think similarly in culture, what we haven't realized is if you do the same thing in culture and you insist upon equality and harm protection above all else by identity, then you're going to strangle your culture. And just a few ways to think about this, can you have good novelists, good movies, good music when everyone's worried about putting foot wrong? Humor, comedy, it's going to be impossible.
Yeah. Right. We were seeing that though a couple of years ago. I feel like it's kind of, comedy has made a resurgence, but even Disney, I think for like several years didn't turn a profit on a movie. because either they were all remakes and everybody's already seen it, so they're not going to go see it again, or they just weren't good. They were just bad movies that were just like white people are bad. And I think a lot of people are like, I hear that every day. I don't want to go watch a movie about that, but that's true. But do you think things are changing when it comes to the cultural, art and movies and books and things?
It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I do think Disney's battles with DeSantis, again, early skirmishes, and some of the go woke, go broke stories like what the hell, Bud Light and some of the other ones, I think there was a sort of correction. And I think there's been some sort of correction. I don't know. I haven't, because I'm not in the US watching sports. Like what's going on ESPN and what is going on in college basketball. I mean, I just don't know how much politics is working its way in there. I mean, this is a question. And I don't know the answer to whether it's changed. I would suspect there's been some easing off. I think in the National Hockey League, I'm Canadian, so that's something I'd know more about. But the Pride jerseys, for example, are no longer something that is being done. I don't know if that's true in other sports like basketball.
The NBA, their ratings are down a lot. And I know that, I have opinions. I grew up playing basketball. I think LeBron James is, a horrible, terrible person. I can't stand him. And I think he ruined the NBA in a lot of ways. But I think that a lot of people were sick of some of the hypocrisy that was coming out of the NBA, especially with LeBron. He's not going to say anything about China. He'll talk about how all white people are racist, but then he won't talk about Hong Kong or any issues with China or like child labor and how his Nike shoes are being made. He doesn't want to talk about any of that because then the NBA is going to lose money because that's a huge market for them. So I think there's been some, I don't know if it's been outspoken, but people sort of are seeing the hypocrisy and just aren't really interested anymore in engaging with that. And so, also the quality of play has gone down because they have to change all the rules. Because everybody's soft now. So that's a whole different problem. But you said something, and I just want to I want to understand this more about basically there's a comprehensive sort of way to bring about human flourishing. And what has happened recently and sort of on the left, generally speaking, and the progressives is that they've reduced it down to only two aspects. And I guess my question would be, as I think about liberalism and it's rooted in liberty, and obviously have positive and negative liberty, I think that modern liberalism is rooted in sort of a negative liberty. But I think that the American Revolution probably was rooted in a positive liberty, and that's a whole historical conversation that we could have. But why is it that sort of negative liberty, that do whatever I want, whenever I want, with whoever I want ideology, is produced this reductionist sort of, we're not going to focus on all the aspects of human flourishing, but just these two? Why do you think that is?
Well, okay. And this kind of gets into the terrain of post-liberalism. And so I think the story I would tell is something different, where negative liberty, which is sort of, you can swing your fist as long as it doesn't touch my nose, up to the point it touches my nose. You can do what you want. You have a sphere of liberty. I actually think that is fine and is actually quite desirable. Now, what Deneen argues is that then tips over, however, into, if you're not swinging your fist, if you're not trying to be an individual and rejecting tradition, then you're not being properly liberal. I mean, so that's a different thing, right? That's sort of now saying this is how you must be, and if you're not doing that, you're a bad person. That's a positive liberalism, where you have a positive ideal for the individual and society now that's actually taking away your freedom. If you want to be a traditionalist and live in a religious way, whatever, that is now seen as backwards. So now you're seeing that pressure to be a certain type of person, individualistic. And that, I think, is where liberalism goes off the rails, classical liberalism, is it moves into something more coercive. And you already see it with John Stuart Mill a little bit, but you definitely see it in the 20th century. And so this idea that you should always prefer change to tradition, you should always prefer difference to commonality, I think is all part of this already early 20th century bohemian avant-garde mindset. You see it in modern art. Art and architecture is already being transformed in in that era. Now, the social justice stuff actually comes in more, I'd say in the 60s more. I mean, yes, there was the New Deal, but that was more about an economic class-based redistribution. There was some worry about, white ethnics, Jews and Italians, and whether they were being treated well. I mean, there was a certain amount of that. But I would say it's not until you get to the 60s that this emphasis on moralism, and particularly a cultural equality type moralism, becomes dominant in the new left. And so they're really focusing on victimhood and disadvantage by identity, mainly race, sex later, and then sexuality. And that becomes the dominant framework, really. And so it's already there in the 60s. It's not a new thing. I mean, already I can never remember a time in Canada, probably, or the US in my lifetime, and this is going back into the 80s, when it was really okay to say immigration's got to be reduced because the cultural change is too fast. I mean, you were already basically going to be canceled for that in the 80s, maybe in the 70s, I don't know. Well, let me just think, when does this start to happen? Probably the 80s. On some race things, already in the 60s. The Moynihan Report into the Black Family, 1965, claiming that the rising rate of fatherlessness was only like 1/3 that were as headed by single mothers. It's pretty low compared to today, but that was already too hot to handle in 1965. That's a change. So what I mean is, so this ideology it's been accelerating in the 2010s. So this thing really starts out in the mid-late 60s. The political correct era, which I lived through at university, when words like Eurocentrism, Afrocentrism, Western Civ has got to go, all this sort of stuff emerges. Political correctness, that term emerged. So this isn't new. It's just accelerated mainly because of social media, and that led to the Great Awakening. But we're now at the end of this period of 60 years, and I actually think it's out of steam. As Matthew Iglesias says, progressivism is out of juice. Like, the new ideas seem to all be coming from the right. What happens next? And I mean, for conservatism, I think really this is about, one of the things that's a bit disappointing to me about the Trump administration is they are not really defining an ideology. They're not defining a new moral order. They're just saying, well, we've had it with morality. We're going to be immoral. We're going to be like, just do whatever we want because we got the power and we're big. My worry about that is it's missing an opportunity to redefine. Whereas if they said, we've been focusing only on the equality and care harm prevention, and we need to have a wider set of human values to achieve human flourishing as a society. And so we have a new vision of the kind of moral order we want. And then pointing to the flaws in the old moral order, saying that, you pushed equal outcomes, that led to discrimination. You pushed hypersensitivity, that clamped down on free speech, pursuit of truth, social cohesion. You attacked our history without providing any context. That damaged social cohesion. We can't recruit enough people now for the military and the police. Like, if they had a much more wide-ranging moral critique to frame what they're doing and did it in a somewhat more kind of orderly, civil way, I think it would be more durable and it would be more profound. And so now maybe that's the next phase. Maybe that's going to take somebody else to do that. I don't know. The jury's still out. I think the disruption probably had to happen, but could it have happened in a more orderly way?
Yeah. Well, what about people like myself who, like, I don't want to argue for the next 100 years, which we will, because that's what people do. So whatever. Argue about morality and these sort of human flourishing. Because I agree with you. I think that there's a way to bring about human flourishing, and my take would be what Western civilization was built on, with all of its flaws, and like, we have to take into consideration that there were problems in Western throughout the history of Western civilization, but it was built on a Judeo-Christian value system or doctrine. If we want to even say doctrine, we can certainly say that it was built on extracted ethics coming from Christian doctrine. And why do I, why, like, I don't, this might sound bad, but why would I debate with a progressive or, a liberal who doesn't believe in Christianity on what the sort of moral standard should be in the West, when we can look to history and we can say, yeah, like it's already worked in multiple occasions when we've used the Christian value system. It seems to be tried and true. It obviously seems to be durable. Why would we have these debates about what's ethically right or not, or what's moral or what isn't? Yeah.
Because if you don't have the debate, you can lose the debate. If you lose the debate,
Sure.
you lose the next generation.
Sure.
And
so then how do you do that? How do you, what debate should be, I guess I'm probably not saying what I should be saying. Like, it's probably not making sense. I get that we should be having conversation around, the specifics, but, something like abortion, and I know this is a hot topic, but like as a Christian, that's not even scientifically, biologically, why do I have to debate people about whether or not that's moral? It's, an embryo as a human being. There's no scientific questioning around that, but it feels like the left wants to have that debate. But what sort of debate? What even is that? It's like we're debating about something that isn't even real. It's like, this is a human. We're killing a human. We should stop.
Yeah,
What do you
but
think?
you still have to have the debate. You still have to make your points because so much is at stake. And I just think, you could take the view, well, it's just all about power.
And that's not
good. And if we have the power, we can force our way in. I don't think that's a good idea.
No, that's a bad idea.
I also think that if you don't I think you have to do both. I mean, you have to do the power thing. You have to make the institutions look like the country. And that is, you have to let the majority values penetrate into these institutions that have been walled off from the majority of the society and have incubated their own very sort of odd value systems. But you also need to, I think you've also got to sort of make the argument. So there's the short-term question of politics and making reforming the institutions. That's a short-term question. But then there's the long-term question of winning the battle of ideas and persuading. And there, the liberals have a point in the sense that you have to persuade. You have to, and that's through logic, but that's also through emotions and images. And this is the tricky part because, you heard the stories, well, the right has the arguments and the left tells better stories. So part of this is that if the stories, where are the stories happening? They're happening in the movies, in books, they're happening in schools. You have to the extent you can, try and rebalance the curriculum and do what you can. You can't do it in, the movies is obviously a private sector initiative, but you can at least try to have a different movie production system, publishing system. And some of that's already existing. I mean, there are different publishers, and there's the internet, which is more of an equalizer because there's more of a balance online. So there's all these ways in which culture can change and evolve.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I about art and story and movies, I 100% agree with you. I'm actually working with a film studio out of Minneapolis right now to create a children's animated TV series. So I think that's the way to do. I obviously love talking about ideas, but a very small portion of the country, they're going to listen to like a 10-hour lecture series on, liberalism or something like that. But they'll watch a movie and they'll engage with the ideas in the movie. And that's the best way to go about changing people's minds, I think. And I have is it okay if I ask one question?
Yeah, sure.
About something you mentioned. And maybe I'm picking up on this wrongly, but you said, here's my question. Do you think that the American Revolution was built on then a negative liberty? Is that what you would say?
Yeah, so I'd say that the philosophy underlying the revolution was Lockean, and John Locke, Locke's an interesting character, but I think that Locke, but certainly Madison and the founders would, in my view, be negative liberals. So constitutional rights, a whole set of rights to assembly and free speech, and all of these things are classical liberal negative liberties. The positive liberalism comes in. I mean, there's an essay called Two Types of Liberty, Isaiah Berlin. You may be probably familiar with it, but this idea of positive liberty is, here's our model for the perfect society. It's a perfectionist version of liberalism, and therefore, and also of the human self. So we need to perfect the human self. You must always strive for autonomy, and again, to be free of the cake of custom. That's sort of the ideal for the individual, and the ideal for the society might be, I don't know, it might be to be a very modern society, or it might be to be a socialist society. Berlin says these are all different positive ideals. Of course, the thing with once you put in a positive ideal, it becomes coercive. I'll give you an example. Let's just say, okay, if I said, well, women can wear a headscarf. You can wear a headscarf if you want. That's negative liberalism. If you really want to wear that headscarf, you can do it. Where's your headscarf? Why aren't you wearing your headscarf? Now you see what that is? That's a switch from the negative, do what you want, to, coercion, you should be doing this.
So where do you draw that line, though? Because right now, somebody could just say, yeah, so, man wants to play in women's sports. You and I, maybe we would say, no, you shouldn't do that.
Right.
And that person would say, well, now you're trying to coerce me into something that I don't align with. And they're not hurting anybody. They're just beating them in races and, jumping higher than them. So what do you say to that?
Well, so there, what you have is a clash of rights. We have a lot of issues in a democracy where we have a clash of rights. So, a guy wants to enter a women's change room. The women don't want the guy in the change room. That's a classic clash of rights, and that's adjudicated in a democracy by majority rule, actually, by legislation. It's a democratic thing. So it is not something you can say, we have a constitutional right, and it's a violation of my trans rights to enter this sporting competition or change room. The problem there is you are now clashing with somebody else's rights. So your fist is hitting someone's nose. And so it's not, whereas if it's just like, I want to go and sit in a park, then you're not actually in anyone's way. You're not actually violating, your rights aren't clashing with somebody else's rights. And that's the distinction here. And so once you have a clash of rights, that is decided democratically by the democracy through legislation and through executive orders and whatever. And people will say, oh, no, but I have my rights, and those should be regardless of what the majority thinks. Well, no, because you have your rights and they're clashing with somebody else's rights. So there is a clash of rights situation, in which case it's not a simple matter. Whereas if somebody was saying, let's say they wanted to throw you in jail and you hadn't committed a crime, even if the majority of the population wanted you in jail because they didn't like the cut of your jib or something, then you could appeal to your constitutional liberties. And there is no clash of rights with somebody. You're not violating somebody else's rights. Therefore, you shouldn't be allowed to be thrown in jail, even if the majority of people want you in jail. And so that is a liberal question, whereas the women's sports is not.
Sure. No, that makes sense. And that wasn't meant to be like a gotcha or anything. Like I just, some of those things I'm trying to think through as I'm trying to figure out what sort of political philosophy I think is the best. And the liberal thing has been very difficult for me. We should maybe we should talk again in the future, but just about like John Adams saying that, and I'm going to botch this, but basically a democratic republic only will work under a morally virtuous people or morally righteous people. But then on the contrary, I do think there are a lot of the founding fathers who were definitely at the very, the best, at the most deist. They weren't really like born again Christians who believed in Jesus. No. Thomas Jefferson he has a Jefferson Bible. He cut out all the miracles from his Bible because he thought that was nonsense. So but then they also sort of justified their, leaving England using the Book of Exodus. So there's a lot of these weird crossovers and things like that I would be interested in hearing. But Overall, I mean, so first off, thanks for doing this podcast, because I think this is all very interesting. And I do think there needs to be institutional reform. I personally want to live in a society, and I want my kids to live in a society that has strong institutions that are trying to do the right thing, that are allowing for debate and conversation and not just shutting people down because, because I don't agree with them on Hamas or something like that. So I don't, I personally like the post-liberal philosophy, and yet I can see what you're saying. I mean, not everybody is going to want to be like a Christian, and so you can't force people to be a Christian. But there are a lot of good morals and ethics that come from Christianity, and I'm a Christian, and so I don't think that I can entirely separate that from my political philosophy while being an honest Christian. Yeah.
But there, you can have your own political philosophy, but then the public institutions, I think, need to be more neutral, because the problem is, once you enforce your moral code, the other people, if they have the strengths, let's say in a blue state, they can enforce a woke moral code. So I think it's just easier not to have that stuff there. I mean, you have to just the very sort of most general moral code there, and then you can always have your more Christian moral code in a church or in some sort of private group. That's the proper place for it. But if you bring it into the public institutions, I think that's probably not the right way to go. That's where I would differ from the post-liberals.
Yeah. Did you think that? Did you read Why Liberalism Failed? I assume.
Yeah.
Probably. Did you feel like his assessment of the institutional decline was accurate? Like his part on this universities and public schools, I felt like was spot on.
Well, so here's my view. I think he's right, but I don't think it's necessary. So my view is, you can have a negative liberal political house, the architecture to be negative liberal. And within that house, you can fill it with many different types of furniture. So the culture, I think, has a separate dynamic from the politics. And so you can have a negative liberal constitution and politics. And let's not forget, a lot of these post-liberals would oppose the American Constitution for these reasons. My view is actually that the Constitution is fine. You could have that negative liberal architecture, but within that, you could have a conservative culture. There's no problem. It's been done in the past. You look around the world, Japan has a very different view than the United States, and they both have kind of more or less liberal democratic constitutional furniture. So I'm not one of these people who thinks that the design of the system points definitely to a particular culture automatically and inevitably, and that is sort of the argument that Deneen and the post-liberals make. And I don't agree with that. I think you could have really quite a different culture within the same institutions.
Yes. No, that's interesting. And I need to think about it more. But thanks so much for doing this. I appreciate you coming on the podcast. It was fun.
Thanks, Andy. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.